Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. This is our monthly Conversations webinar, and GREG is hosted by New Zealand's Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, MB. And as such, I begin, as I always do, with the MB opening karakia, and I do so now. Tawhia tō mana kia mau, kia maia, ka huri, takuaro, ki te pai ka hurangi. Ke reira te oranga moku. Ma mahi tahi ka ora ka puawhai, a mātou mahi katoa ka pono ka tika. Tihei mauri ora. Well, now we're all together. It's very nice to see you, members of the audience, and I can see that a number of you are still arriving. So if you've just joined us, as I say, you're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based in New Zealand, among the world's first professional networks for users of state power, and I'm not talking about electricity. And I haven't used that one for months, members of the audience. They don't get any better. That probably comes out every 2 or 3 months. But I hope it's no shock to you that you can make live connections on this network with our panel, because if you've seen previous episodes of these webinars, which are on our YouTube channel, along with a number of other products and films, you'll see that these are conversations that we have to provoke conversations that you may be having or that you may wish to have, the sort of conversations that in regulatory terms make the world go round. We're at episode 4 this month, and today's conversation is a conversation about dialogue and design. And before we go into further details on that, just some housekeeping tips before I introduce our panelists. As you know from the Zoom invitation that you will have responded to, these webinars are live and recorded, and in each case in the public domain. The Q&A function, for those of you who are not used as much to Zoom, is at the bottom of the screen, and you're very welcome. And please do, if you've got a question or a comment, pop that in there at any time. We'll pick them up. You can also get to vote on them, and that's really good because sometimes we find we've got a heck of a lot of questions across this hour together, and we need to just sort of deal with them in a priority order. There's also a chat function. It's absolutely not rude, members of the audience, to use the chat function to talk to each other, because in as much as we can on these screens, it's also a networking event, or there may be something you want to register or react. The chat and the Q&A expressions that you put are not recorded. It's a matter for you, and they're very much for this webinar. Today's conversation is a conversation about dialogue and design, and in a change to the advertised schedule, you'll notice there are 2 rather than 3 guests. Steve Watson, unfortunately, is unavoidably unavailable to join us, but you'll be able to watch him, as I may have mentioned, or we may have mentioned collectively in some of the promotional material, in last year's conference recording of a conversation between policy and regulatory practitioners. That very, very important dialogue which we're going to touch on today. How can practitioners in both policy and regulatory areas make policy design work? The conversation's good to have in the first place. It's essential to have in the first place. If the conversation doesn't happen well, or doesn't happen according to some ground rules, there could be some tough conversations later, or worse when it comes to implementing a policy. So what are the talking points? I'm delighted to have our 2 guests in the studio today. I'm joined by first Peter Mersi, the new commissioner, very new. Congratulations, Peter, of Inland Revenue. I think it's week 4. Formerly a chief executive from the Ministry of Transport. Before that, Land Information New Zealand, brings in a lot of high quality experience, obviously at the executive level, looking at policy operations, regulatory business transformation. And we're also equally delighted to be joined by Debby Butler, who's the Inspector General Regulatory Systems at the Ministry of Primary Industries. Very good friend of GREG. Nice to see you again, Debby. Debby's had a range of senior management roles in the public service, covering audit, risk, corporate governance, directorship, and also critically regulatory system review work, which Debby touches on in one of the interviews that she's given to us at GREG, actually, on the GREG website. And we'll take a look at those sort of points, Debby, I'm sure, as we talk about regulatory systems and the importance of their integrity and what works for design. Thank you both for joining us. One more thing before we jump in, members of the audience. You'll see at the bottom of the screen that you can emote. You'll see the little face of the person with a cross embedded in the top right-hand corner of their head. And you may ask, why is that person smiling? I think that's crying tears of laughter, I hope. Oh, look, that's it. We know that they're working. Keep them flying, members of the audience, because it is a multi-pronged reaction kind of program that we've got. So I think the rules of engagement are fairly well set out. There's a lot of you here. It's nice to see you. It always is. Peter and Debbie, a warm welcome to you both. Peter, I'll start with you and then I'll go straight to Debbie. Just how important is it just to set the ground rules for, I call them broadly, policy practitioners and regulatory practitioners to engage from each of your perspectives?
Kia ora, Ian. Thank you very much and welcome everyone. It's great to be here, and hi Debbie, nice to be working with you again so closely. Look, I think over the last 20 years, we've learned a lot about the importance of engaging, whether it's in policy development and or thinking about the operation and in the regulatory field. And understanding, particularly as public servants, what our role is, how far we can go, and how we go about doing that in a safe and constructive way is very important. So, look, I think I've seen it develop over that period. I was saying just earlier on that, it wasn't that long ago that regulators in particular saw it almost as against their set of principles, and it was good practice not to be engaging with the people that they regulated. And so I think we've come a long way, and the quality of our regulation is improving as a result of that.
Yeah, and it is not that long ago, I think, Peter, and I think that's a really interesting point. A lot's happened, Debbie, hasn't it, in terms of the change? And I guess, how does that play in, and generally, how is it's so important for that dialogue to happen? This is a conversation about dialogue and design.
Definitely is. And I reflect a lot on this when I do my reviews of our regulatory systems at Ministry for Primary Industries. And one of the things that consistently plays out in this conversation is, how can you know and improve a system in a learning system if you don't know from the regulators what's working and what's not? What are the workarounds that are occurring out at the front? And how's that feeding into policy so that they redesign to meet the new challenges, the new landscape, the new issues and risks that are emerging, or vulnerabilities that we're recognising. And I think there's a growing piece of work now, or a body of work, to connect the two, to ensure that this conversation's ongoing and not just a one-off set and forget. There's your policy, go away and do it, and we're not going to do it again for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years until, Lord and above, we've got problems, because things are not working well. So I think there is that part of it. And I also just wanted briefly to reflect on, we've probably got a lot of people from different agencies here on listening in today. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the different types of regulatory agencies we have, because Peter's come out of largely a policy and oversight shop with Ministry of Transport. He's come into a shop that has the broad brush of policy and regulatory responsibilities, as have I. And then there are others, yet again, for example, I just take corrections, it's one I know, where you have one agency doing all of it. However, you also then have a regulated, statutorily regulated party who are third party, who are connected in and contracted to provide regulatory services. So from all of those different parties, how do they feed in the key important things that need to be known to improve a system on a regular basis?
And I think, just picking up off that, Debbie, there could be people in this audience who say, this is not me. And I think what you've touched on is a taxonomy of all the different sorts of folk it could be, in terms of policy, pure, I guess what you might call pure operational and operational policy. It really is a broad church that this relational need touches, isn't it? Did you want to sort of talk, Peter, about a little more, perhaps from your experiences and perhaps just coming back into NLO Review, on why engage?
Yeah, look, I'm going to pick up where something that Debbie touched on. Yeah. Look, I've been a public servant for 40 odd years, and when I first started, I think in the policy world, we used to spend a lot of time identifying the problem and then working to find what I would call the solution. Now, we've moved a long way in that time, and what Debbie was describing was that realization that problems are very complex. Very, very rarely are the problems we collectively are dealing with, very rarely do they have a single solution. More often than not, what you're trying to do is iterate towards a better place tomorrow than you are in today. Now, in that sort of world, that point about the importance of dialogue, of engagement and understanding becomes critical, because when you do anything, whether it's a policy, a new operational construct, there will be a range of unintended consequences that will arise. Unless you have the ability to engage with the people throughout that cycle, all the way around, you won't actually know what they are. You won't know the significance of those, and therefore you won't be able to correct for it over time. Because again, picking up on the point that Debbie made, this is about continuously iterating to improve. So I think when you then put that on the construct of sort of the conversation we're having today about dialogue, you're wanting to set up an engagement which is long lasting. It's about building relationships that you can use to ensure that as you are, regardless of what stage in that cycle you're at, you've built a relationship that enables you to engage and get some real, true, information back that is going to be helpful to the outcomes you're ultimately trying to achieve.
And I think it's a continuing state of affairs. So to the extent it was over the days of, if I could put it this crudely, lob it over the wall and over to you next door, it's not. You're saying temporarily the relationship is before, during and after, and with others, and it's a continuing dialogue within the relationship. Some will find that trite, mercifully, some watching won't. To the extent people are in it, when does that sort of relationship practically become more formalized?
Look, I mean, I think that depends on the circumstances to some extent. But for me, part of it is about the authorizing environment. Again, coming out of a policy shop, traditionally or very often, policy is held very closely because of that desire to ensure that ministers have the ability to make unencumbered decisions. Now, having said that, building relationships with people in the sector, with people who are going to be impacted by these policies, so that you can have open conversations about if we do it this way, how will that work? I mean, in a real life example, we had the clean car discount announced last year as part of the emissions plan. When the Ministry of Transport, we had designed what we thought was a system that would work. When we exposed that to the various parts of the industry, a number of them said, actually, we just cannot implement that. So you're not going to get the outcome. Now, we had some really good relationships already built in that area. We hadn't leaned into them early enough to ensure that even in our first draft, those questions were answered. We then entered a really constructive conversation with those parties and came up with something that made it work.
That's a great example. I hope you don't mind me jumping in, Ian.
Jump away, Debbie.
I won't jump off the cliff, but just in terms of that thing about consultation versus engagement comes up time and again. So, I had a stint in local government for my sins before the central government. And, I did a piece of work way back then about what's the difference between consulting with someone and properly engaging. Look, we have a responsibility as treaty partners to fully engage. And that is an upfront piece of work. You take people along on the journey and, the 1,000 cups of tea, get to know your partners, get to understand the issues, and then bring them on a journey or go on their journey with them, actually more appropriately. Now, that said, people listening will go, well, hang on a minute. Our role is as a regulator, so our role is to change behaviour. Yes, correct, but unless you have a reasonable amount of, I suppose, what we call social acceptance or social license to do this, you're not going to get that. And that's what Peter's alluding to. And I like the example because my conversations with Ian on this has been that it's not just a dialogue between policy and operations then. It becomes a three-legged stool with a really critical response and involvement that you have with the community. And what is it that you're trying to achieve, and why should they care? And why should they agree that it's the right thing to do? And then when it comes to a time to consult, you're already on that journey where you've met those three key principles. And I know Ian and I have talked a little bit about a fourth-legged stool, which is that transformational part, which is an internal, how do you actually get, and Peter will be able to talk a little bit to that, I think, but how do you get this journey to be transformative for everyone without completely killing the whole system, which would be very easy to do if you tried to do all things for all people.
And I think there's an interesting point now. Just jump in if I may, because you're getting, both of you getting hearts and applauses thrown at you and the emojis, and we've got some Q&A. Keep them rolling, members of the audience, and do vote on them. Peter, I think you're about to say something and I interjected.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I was just going to add something in there, something that Debbie said that sparked a thought. You asked a sort of question, when do you make this, what, the nature of the formality? I think one of the things that's really important to do when you are building that relationship, and Debbie, I wouldn't underestimate the point that Debbie was making. You should make those relationships before you need them. So, your first couple of engagements should not necessarily be around a specific issue. Just go and have a talk and meet people. But being clear with them about that, there may be times that you would like to be able to share information with them and it would be confidential. How comfortable are they holding that confidentiality? In a world where they're uncomfortable, you would want them to be able to raise that with you and tell you so that you can then manage that issue. You need to get to the point of saying, look, there may be things we cannot tell you, or we ultimately may not be able to tell you our ultimate advice, because until ministers have considered that, we need to retain that flexibility. There are all sorts of parameters you can put around it. Ultimately, the ability to disagree, but to do so respectfully, and in my view, most importantly, understanding the other party's view, I think that's quite critical. So setting the groundwork when you're building those relationships to build trust, but to put some agreed understandings around it to make it a safe environment for everyone, because the thing we often forget is we're concerned about the management of the risks at our end. For many of these people, and particularly those that are representatives of organisations, they are having to manage their constituencies as well. So I think that's just something to bear in mind.
And I think the interesting thing, Peter, I think you're directing that answer towards third parties. It's slightly cheeky of me, but how much could be said by applying that same to policy and operational in the same internal shop?
Well, I'd like to think, Ian, that we've made a lot of progress there. I my fingers crossed, because when you're part of the same organisation, my own view is that some of those secrecy, I often do hear that we can't tell someone on the operational part of the business because, I just don't buy that. They're all bound by the same organisational requirements.
Absolutely.
And as an organisation, in order to give the best advice, there is no way you can design policy without bringing operations in, and there's no way operations can deliver a policy without understanding what its original objectives were.
Right, thank you for that. Let's go to the questions, and there's some raging votes here. I'm going to go to the one that carries the most. At least some consultation goes to question. We can all see it. Seems to provide well-resourced parties an opportunity to pursue their own self-interest. They may also have a deep knowledge of industry in a way the regulator doesn't. So I guess, how do we keep those interests in check, ensuring those private interests don't trump public and societal interests? There's a little bit here of the regulator's humility, isn't it? And knowing we can't do everything, getting over that point and then getting into the two-way, but also realizing these are privateers we're talking to. How do you both manage that?
Well, I'll have a crack at this one. I'm not sure I've got an answer, but what I would say is that the engagement is a mechanism to hear and to understand. It becomes the combination of and that's where the dialogue between regulatory and policy is critical, becomes their role to determine what's the best outcome after hearing it all. So yes, there'll always be interests in every part of that conversation, including through the policy and the operational or regulatory arm, and the external stakeholders. I think we are bound by parliamentary commission rules to do a proper RIA and a RIS on these things. So we think about that, we think about the risks, we think about the interests, and then we come out with also, you know, and people listening to this will also appreciate that there is a ministerial requirement to satisfy. So a ministerial platform or a mandate that they wish to see happen. Sometimes, you know, that free and frank advice, sometimes this doesn't work, Minister. How do we get a compromise that will satisfy everyone? Or it might be with an external interest, private interest, lobbying a minister. And then how do you overcome that? That becomes a part of that engagement and communication puzzle too.
I just want to pick up on that, Debbie, if I may. The distinction, and Peter, I'm sure you want to jump in as well, the distinction, careful distinction, I should say, as one of our audience is saying, between engagement versus consultation. One is very different to the other, isn't it?
Yeah, and there are times when ministers will want us to consult and not to engage. And you know, ultimately, some of these decisions are theirs to take. And I think, just picking up the question before as well, the point about people having perspectives and wishing to push their own barrow, for want of a better phrase, frankly, you would be very disappointed if they weren't doing that. You probably aren't talking to the right people. Part of our job is to both listen to that and to listen for understanding, and to be able to accurately reflect that to ministers or decision makers should they ask. I mean, I'm a big fan of, you should be able to articulate the other party's view just as strongly as your own.
Yes.
But ultimately, part of our job as public servants in particular is to put that information we get into some sort of framework to distill from it ultimately what is it that's in the public interest, that's the public good, which are the things that we are striving to deliver. So you know, I don't have a problem at all listening to someone deliver to us their particular personal perspectives or the perspectives of their organisations. And I know that we've all been in situations where some of them will say, look, from a system perspective, this is what we think, but you'll need to understand that when we go public, we're going to have to take an alternate view, and that's fine too. So I think it's respecting each other's roles and perspectives, and just being able to bring all that together.
Thank you, Peter. And to you, Debbie, just modifying the question slightly, the distinction between consultation and engagement. And I'm talking also in terms of policy and regulatory as well as third parties. And I want to throw in a four-letter word that begins with F, and that's fear. What is it about institutional potential internalization-based fear that kind of affects the efficiency of what I've just asked?
Yeah, good questions. So I'll answer that in a sort of a roundabout way, along with the question around the engagement versus consultation. Look, and there is often a fear that the policy teams have done so much work, they've engaged with the regulatory, the operational side, they're ready to go out and consult, right? Go out to the stakeholders to consult, and you just get this huge amount of submissions saying, what planet are you guys on? You're not even thinking about what's the current evolving global situation or whatever it is that's important to them at the time. And you get a huge amount of sort of pushback. And so then it becomes very difficult to make a change after you've done that. So my answer to what does engagement look like then, it's an ongoing dialogue. It shouldn't be, you know, the best engagement I've seen are the forums that are regular and constant, and you might change the audience or the participants of that, but the ongoing conversation, if you have a forum that you regularly consult on around food safety, for example, and you know it's got to include people from the health sector, people from community sectors, the vulnerable, children, etc., then you know you're going to get a range of different views. But as you continue that dialogue over time, that engagement becomes hugely important to the outcome you're seeking, which is the right settings, regulatory settings. And so then when you come to consult, as I say, it becomes a three-way thing between the minister, what they're looking for, between the policy and how they've developed it, and between the operational regulatory part who are going to implement it and deliver it. Then you have all those parties understanding what will happen if they go this way or that way, and then putting it in place, you find that you've got a much more, I suppose, smooth water than you would normally if you're just consulting without that ongoing part. That said, it's an awful lot of energy and exercise expended, and we don't all have huge resources at our fingertips, and government, to be honest, is really tight. So how do you do that well? Well, I think that just becomes part of how you shape your policy mechanisms.
It is an interesting one, though, isn't it, Debbie? Because I just can keep them flying, members of the audience. I have lots of questions coming. It's good. Another F word, fatigue. Developing dialogues with our regulated communities runs risk consultation fatigue. I'm going to apply that also to policy and operational colleagues. What should we be doing as regulators to minimise that? Or I use the phrase, draw the line.
Well, I think that's a much more challenging question in many ways, Ian, because ultimately for quality policy and regulation, we have to be engaging. And I don't know if I'm allowed to use the C word that was referred to in the chat. But yes, there are people at the end of what we do, whether you want to call them customers, clients, citizens, all of which begin with C. And ultimately, in whatever role we are performing, we are doing this to deliver a public value of some sort. And now, I think the question becomes when we need to tailor our engagements and our the extent to which we work together with parties to jointly solve issues, scalable to the type of issue. You don't want to go out and have an engagement on something that is not warranted. I can give you a really good example of that. In the Ministry of Transport, we were starting that process of trying to think much more actively about how to engage with Māori. And a team came to me and said, we've got this fantastic engagement plan with 16 hapu, all to do with a wording change we're going to make in the Civil Aviation Act. And my question was, so this is about clarifying a statement that's already in the Act. It wasn't about exploring an issue that we were trying to grapple with. And so that wasn't going to be engagement or consultation. It was really just information provision. So be clear about what it is. The last thing I want to just add is one of the things that COVID taught us, as we went through COVID, and we're all fatigued from COVID, so that everybody comes again there. But when you engage with people, they buy in to what you are trying to achieve. And another example of this is when Auckland went into lockdown and they had to ministers wanted to put a regional boundary in place, a hard boundary. We needed to ensure that freight could continue to go across the border. We had a number of sessions with the freight industry on, that's our problem. How do we design a system collectively with them that would deliver the outcome? Because actually it was an outcome they wanted as well. So by involving them right from the very beginning, they owned the solution and made it work.
Thank you for that, Peter. Can I just move us almost to the sequel piece of that, is the evaluation. I think you've obviously touched on it in terms of the monitoring, both of you, of continuous state of affairs relationship. Question here about it being monitoring and evaluation is often challenging. So you've got the dialogue set up between policy and operations, or I'm saying policy, people, regulated parties, everybody's here. But is talk enough to properly evaluate the effects of the policy? And when do you move beyond the dialogue without denigrating it to something that's more rigorous, more structured and more measurable?
I think that's a work in progress,
and
we are sort of learning our way through that. Again, it's not something that's just going to be an immediate, yes, that's what you do. I think as Peter alluded, it depends on the what is it that you're trying to achieve or do. If it has, like the COVID example, I thought was a good one from Peter, if it has significant ramifications for people's health and safety and well-being, then it needs a significant level of analysis to determine whether you've got the right settings, because that's that risk analysis that you would do in that situation. However, what I like about that example is the agility. and look, agility in fragility is my sort of the way I look at that, because when you look at how fragile the system was at that moment, and we're probably looking at that in retrospect now and going, oh, wow, how do we do that? Government stepped up and became incredibly agile and moved in ways that we probably regulatory wise would never have attempted to do before. This is something that I know people have talked about in other sessions. What do we do to maintain that? So engagement then becomes, well, let's not just talk for the need of talking. Engagement becomes, we have an outcome we want to achieve. So evaluating it later is about sort of saying, well, did we achieve that outcome, or will we achieve that outcome? So it's about saying, here is what we want to do. This is where we want to get to. What's it going to take to get there at the shortest possible means? And sometimes that's sometimes regulators have to make difficult decisions that don't sit well with all of those parties, and well, a lot of the time actually. And so therefore then when you evaluate the effectiveness of that or otherwise, then you can make an assessment on, was your engagement useful, efficient, effective, and did it have the right outcome? And would you do that again? And then lessons learned becomes important. What we're not doing well enough, I think, is looking at what worked well and saying how did that happen. We do all of the lessons learned when we fail, and we think what's going wrong here, what should we do better, but often you're not doing it for the good things. And I think there's so much to be learned in there.
It's a regulatory equivalent of being kind to yourself. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Peter. If you've just joined us, we're at about half time and you're watching GREG, and we've been talking about a conversation about dialogue and design. We're having that conversation now with Peter, Mersi and Debbie Butler, and they're terrific. And so members of the audience, you keep those questions coming in. We've talked about the importance of having a strong policy regulatory relationship. I've hybridized two words and just made a new one, and also relationships with stakeholders right from the start, and actually in a sense before. We've talked about recognizing roles and goals and that things can change unexpectedly. We've talked about the need for humanity, agility, and recognizing our own fragility. We've talked about the obvious need to communicate, have the right people in the room to see the systemic picture. I want to take some brass tacks for a minute. When we've got everyone in the room, how do we work out who's in charge?
Well, presumably someone has called the group together. Look, I think when you're bringing a group together, and it depends on the nature, it's very much situation dependent. But what's really important whenever you're bringing a group together is to ensure that everyone at the table has an opportunity to speak and to participate. Getting the right people at the table can be quite a challenge. I think you need to think quite hard about who are the parties that it's most important for you to invest time and energy with to bring into that conversation. And I mean, also think about at what level you want to have that conversation. If you're talking about things at a delivery end, for example, the sort of people you are going to want in the room are very different from if you were talking about high-level sort of policy and behavioural change, for example. So just think quite carefully about some of those things.
Just in terms, sorry, Debbie, I think I cut in. You were going to, no, it's me. Okay, I was going to move it just a little to the point about third parties, but also in the context, and a number of us are going through them or have been through them, and some of us even have the medals. Business transformation, and I'm particularly looking at the IT transformation. I'm making this up because it's Friday, but let's just suppose there's a very large business transformation project which touches policy and operational settings in an agency. You could have a commercial off-the-shelf product. You could have something that's a sort of a hybridized thing. You've effectively got a trialogue between the policy, the regulatory, and the transformation team. There might still be those in the world who'd say two's company and three's a crowd when you're having those sorts of conversations. Peter, what's your message to those people?
I think it's really important when you are, in many of the things we do, to start off thinking about what are the principles that we want to use that will guide decision making. So in the case of inland revenues transformation, and I'm effectively speaking as a little bit of an outsider, because as Ian mentioned, 4 weeks here, I can hardly claim ownership of the fantastic transformation that occurred here. But what is clear to me is that they had a set of principles that helped define and determine their decision-making, one of the key ones was, we want the outcome to make it easy for our customers and our clients to meet their tax obligations or receive the payments that they are due.
Yes.
Now, if you start off with something as simple as that, then as you start to work your way across the policy, operational, IT sort of spectrum, that you start to get a coordination. So simple things like, if you're getting something which is truly off the shelf, and there's a whole lot of different definitions about what off the shelf means, but to the extent that you can simplify your policy to slot in under something that already exists rather than creating something bespoke, it means that in the future you can make changes to that in a way that is likely to least impact your customers and your clients. So by having a set of principles that help guide that, I think you can bring parties into the room. I don't buy three's a crowd. In fact, the more the merrier in many ways, because you want them all to be bought into that same set of principles and the direction you're going in.
And it does really pick up on the stewardship point. I think in a sense, regulatory stewardship, and also perhaps a different species of that slightly IT stewardship.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because you've got a whole level of governance that you have to think differently about when you're thinking IT. I'm reflecting on what Peter says, and I really like that decision-making framework that you're talking about. But I also think that there is a cultural requirement for leadership and ownership when it comes to a serious matter like this. If you can have good leadership but not ownership, so not accountability for an outcome, and that will not get you to where you need to be. So you need to have ownership. If you can build a cultural thing at the beginning of that project that makes everyone accountable for the outcome, not just one of you, not just 5 of you, but everyone owns that outcome. So whatever their part in it creates that need that, oh my God, it didn't go well. What can we do differently? Okay, I'll own that and I'll fix that and I'll do something about that. That's the key principle. And I think one of the tenets of that is allowing that fail-safe thing to happen, or safe failing, I should probably say, and ensuring that you actually are learning from it, but you've put your hand up saying that didn't work so well, can we try that one again, and actually just making sure that nobody feels that that's a bad thing, as long as you've got the time. But in going back to that combination, there's a third part to that: leadership, ownership, and agility. Again, I'll come back to that, because it's not without, and it's not for any weird reason that they call the transformation in software agile. And that is that new way of working where you have Kanbans, you have stand-ups, everybody's in the room. So to Peter's point, everybody's in the room making those decisions together. If you can do that outside in a regulatory form, how wonderful would that be? Everybody in the room making that decision together, owning it, owning the outcome, and then telling you when there's something's not working right,
And I think that beautifully, actually, what we both said, if I'm going to say so, picks up on a couple of the questions we've seen coming through. It was keep them coming, everyone. But this one, practically speaking, what are your views on the best ways for policy practitioners to engage with operational staff in their own organisation, workshops, sharing papers, getting comments, other activities? I think that sort of touches upon it for any of these 2 ways. And I just mention also the set of courses that one of our members of the audience has suggested, but all persons should engage with, who engage with the public, is the IAP2 spectrum of public participation. Very clear guidance on the different types of engagement. There's another question that's sort of come up here, which is, I guess, the reverse of the fatigue point that we were talking about. And it was really in terms of compacting timing. Do you have any kind of tips in your experience of really moving the story along? Because there could be cultural issues about how long to discuss something. There could be, but the business of government has its own timetable, doesn't it? Of course, parliamentary as well. Any kind of general thoughts on time?
That's quite a hard one to answer, and I think look, it's very situation specific. Sometimes, and with COVID was a classic example. Whichever element of that you looked at, we were having to do things, to pick up Debbie's word, in an agile way, and with a speed that meant it was almost an obscene speed in many ways, that we didn't have the luxury of being able to work our way through all of the options. We had to go with what we thought were the right ones. I guess the things that help, I come back to sort of what are the principles what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and what are the principles that you want to use to help you arrive at the right outcome, and that will sort of help you get to that point. But look, there are points where one of the things that we spent a bit of time doing over the last few years was putting the rail system, KiwiRail, back into putting it into a different sort of funding frame. And that was all about getting clarity from the government about what they wanted from a rail system and how to take that forward. Now, it's fair to say that not everyone around that table agreed all the time. And there are some points at which you just have to say, look, we've now recorded the disagreement here. We are going to have to keep moving, because we need to make progress to get to the outcome. So we're going to draw a line. And you just have to be able to, again, build the relationships so that they can support that sort of decision and keep the process moving.
And presumably have relationships on the shelf already in the ideal world.
Absolutely. You can only do that if you've built up something in the bank to be able to sort of get a bit directional in those situations.
And I mean, there's a course correction point that comes in here. I think both of what you've said, it's the realism with which the dialogue or the trialogue or the multi-party discussions conducted. You're getting people coming in as stakeholders or dealers, if you're a policy, and they're saying, look, this isn't Narnia, this is New Zealand, this is how it happens. And this is how we react to that. To what extent is it, I can't really put this eloquently, but is it okay to course correct and have regulatory humility either to counterparties indoors or outdoors?
Yeah, look, I think you're onto it there. What is the problem with, we've talked about setting and forgetting not being appropriate. Set and adapt is the new way. What is the problem with taking a stand on, and so we are developing too, I'll just go back a step, we are developing a better system of skeleton legislation and adapting our tertiary or secondary now regulation. Okay, so what I see as an opportunity here is drawing more on that principle. So you set an overarching legislative platform on which you want to achieve an outcome. The how you do it can be changed depending on what experiences you're seeing as you go. Now, an example of that, and I'll use the Food Act. It came in 2018, it was the new Food Act. After that, shortly after that, there was a review into a whey protein concentrate matter that had occurred, had caused major mayhem in infant formula issues. And what we decided to do at that point was to sort of take on board the changes there and adapt it and readdress. So we did the food regulatory change, which has just actually been enacted. So that's an example of setting a skeleton outcome and then adapting as you recognise there's gaps or changes needed in there. And I think this is and I know the Parliamentary Commission is trying desperately, PCE is trying desperately to get that way of working embedded well. And I think the better we are at this conversation, this dialogue you've been talking about, Ian, the more quickly we can actually see opportunities to shift that regulatory setting much more quickly than what we used to be able to do. So it doesn't take 4 years now to put something through legislative change. It happens with a stakeholder engagement. Well, let's say, let's be honest and call it regulated party engagement.
Yeah.
And knowing then that you've got the settings that are the best possible ones you can do for now. It doesn't matter if in 2 years' time they get changed again.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Peter. And I can see, Peter, you've picked up on that point in the chat yourself with the fact that it's outcomes. You certainly had the audience, one of the audience, he had me at hello, he says. And the same person, Grant, is asking a question which I think is a very good one. What does the panel say about the regulatory generalist versus generalist specialist versus specialist divide or continuum, where I guess planning for dialogue or designing really cuts right across policy, operations and systems and everywhere? You do have to be a jack of all trades, don't you, really?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, look, there will always be room, I think, in our system for people who are at different points on that spectrum. And, you know, I can think of a number of people who, for example, are true specialists in a particular area for whom it can be quite challenging, you know, building relationships in that soft way, right? You get them talking about a really technical issue and they are really comfortable. But for them, you know, going and having a much more, let's say, open conversation in you know, it can be quite an uncomfortable space. I think the point there is not all of us either have to be or are good at everything. Yeah. So let's work with others. This is all, you know, we use the word team all the time, right? We are a team. Let's use our team to get the best out of us as a collective.
Yeah. And that's where it's the division of labour, and also it's, I'm going to make an unashamed commercial plug for some of the products and things that GREG and other communities of practice try to bring to the party in terms of working across and in terms of that very practical dealing that emanates from discussions of this kind. One of the things that we've looked at in previous episodes, which I sort of see behind the scenes here, is the idea of the interconnectedness of all things, the idea of regulatory stewardship, which we've touched on, regulatory failure, which we recently touched on, and regulating in a crisis. It seems that the dialogue that we're talking about here, or the multi-party conversation, goes to all of those things, doesn't it? Stewardship, failure mitigation, crisis control.
Oh, can I just say, I think that's a bit dangerous to sort of make that, to draw that together. I think there is a place for thinking about regulatory failure and understanding the risks and trying to mitigate for that. Definitely there is, and we've all done it in the space of the last few years.
Yeah.
But can I be a bit frank and say we need to be forward-looking? And I'm hearing and seeing a lot of agonising over past failures and thinking, will this happen to us, and how do we identify that?
Yeah,
I'm really interested in seeing us think differently about that. So, and I'll draw back to your point about, or to Grant's point about, you know, is it's regulatory specialists and or generalists in that, because if you are looking forward to see what your outcome will be and to see how you're going to achieve that, there's a need for specialists, so SMEs in the room as well as generalists. But because I think where the value in generalists is in thinking more broadly. So a specialist is naturally clever at what they do and might well be able to draw sort of assumptions based on that. But you'll get a generalist that will ask some questions that the SME just has not even thought of in a different frame. And I like that concept, and I want to hear that more. So I don't think it matters whether or not you focus on it, but everyone has different capabilities and qualities in the room. And just like Peter and I, we think differently, but we vehemently agree on a lot of things, you know. And I think when it comes to it, if you shape a conversation or a dialogue to be outcomes focused, forward looking, and then you work backwards to see and understand whether you've touched on all the risks and mitigations you need to, that's sufficient in the set and adapt way that we're trying to achieve. Because as Peter mentioned before, you at your peril, do you spend 6 months engaging on something and still not be comfortable making a decision? You do have to draw the line at times. So I've said a whole lot of things together there, but I'm just saying, but probably for crisis mitigation, like MPI is thinking desperately about FMD right now, foot and mouth disease. Mm-hmm. We've got operations plans stood up. We've got teams thinking about all of that. Yes, we're working on that. We're looking forwards at that, not backwards, about what we can do to sort of in retrospect.
So we're defined by our positive triggers, not where things haven't gone quite right, while not being irresponsible. It's not being carefree and it's not being careless, but it's just getting that balance right. Again, I think Peter and Debbie, to your point, it's about actually primarily focusing on the outcomes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And just to pick up Debbie's point, I mean, I sort of see stewardship as that's the thing, that's our guiding light. As stewards of a regulatory system, whatever that system might be, stewardship means we need to have that long-term perspective in our mind, which is the forward-looking bit that Debbie's talking about. And if we're clear about what we're trying to achieve and we understand the nature of the risks, then in a sense that helps us both mitigate regulatory failure and deal with crises that occur. And now it's very important where there are regulatory failures that we do undertake those reviews to learn from them and actually take the learnings and do something with it. But I think if we are investing in our stewardship function, that will help us respond to those other things.
I guess the difficulty that might flow from that is the leadership team, organisation, institute is very, very clear as to what it sees as the aims. In terms of the sort of more functional, but no less vital, the exercise of regulatory judgment and discretion, is there a difficulty in making it more relevant, those sort of higher order norms that we could all hopefully buy into, to those who are executing? What are the difficulties in practice that arise in terms of that kind of connect?
I mean, I think you've hit on a key point. For any organisation where you've got sort of a strategy of any form, and you're wanting to get that translated down into things that are real and material for decision makers within the system, and the ways in which we communicate, the ways in which we started off this conversation talking about engaging with various participants in the system, and that's as much about a joint system of educating to agree what some of those outcomes might be. So, look, I think it is challenging, and people who are exercising regulatory powers and regulatory authority, they need they'll be looking for sufficient support to know that they aren't going outside the bounds of what is acceptable.
Yeah.
But I think even there, we need to be mindful of the importance of managed risk-taking, innovation. We can't sit on our laurels, and this comes to Debbie's point. We must be forward-looking. The system around us is changing all the time, and we must change with it.
Debbie, did you want to jump in there as well?
Look, I think this is worth a whole other conversation, actually. It's probably, Ian, it's on a list that you could add, because this whole thing about the discretion that the front line have, I call it front line, but regulators have, to do or not to do something, is something I'm very, very interested in. And I think there's not a lot of science around that, actually. It's not something that every regulator does the same way, right? So every regulator has different ways and constructs and culture, actually, that leads to doing things in different ways. And then how do you get consistency, etc.? That's a whole other area I'm really fascinated in. I'd love more conversation about. I don't know the answer to that, because I see it myself. We have 7 different systems and macro systems in Ministry for Primary Industries, and every one of them has very different settings and very different ways of working, and largely driven out of the legislation, but also through the culture, the leadership culture.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, Debbie. And actually, unashamed commercial plug from me, regulatory discretion is something that we've been doing as a very popular workshop. We're looking at it both potentially as a sort of an agency-specific piece or a general piece. Members of the audience, you might be interested in something like that, and we're open to you dropping us a line. The exercise of regulatory discretion. Next month, we'll be looking at responsive regulation, which is a related cousin of the point, because how do you exercise your discretion where your agency's institutionally responsive? Debbie, I'm just going to go back to you, if I may, in terms of the way we look at things internally and talk about sort of matrix-based ways of working. I'm a GM, and my bottom line isn't touched by what happens over there, but I can see it's in the overall strategic interest of the agency to deal. But it's going to hit my bottom line, and I've got proper responsibilities there. How do I sort that out?
Gosh, again, you've picked on a real live wire right now. And I think the way that central government has shaped and reshaped itself over years has lent itself to sort of centralise, decentralise. And many of the regulatory agencies and the audience listening today will be from having different experiences with that. Look, I'm grappling with that myself right now as I do a review and thinking about that. personally, I come back to the accountability and leadership thing. It is about owning your part in the outcome. So yes, you might not have, so an example I can use currently with the Ministry for Primary Industries is we have a compliance team that is centralised, and so that compliance has a set of different inspectorates and a set of investigators, and they do a range of different things for each of our different business units. And if I use, I don't know, animal welfare as an example, that's one where you've got a central compliance team, or probably it's not a good example, but anyway, a central compliance team who have other responsibilities too. They're looking at NATE compliance, and so where do they put their effort, and why would they necessarily focus on animal welfare when they go out and do? They might be cross-warranted and have a range of different responsibilities, and biosecurity as well as theirs, and so therefore how do they focus on what's important? So for me, the discussion at leadership and setting the tone and the ownership culture is really critical in this. Why are you not part of that discussion or dialogue with the regulators, with the business who perhaps the operational policy, the small p policy people who are making changes to the regulation, and the big P policy people, to think about how that's working or not working. There are lots of different mechanisms you use. We have a compliance oversight group, for example, that actually shares responsibility with all of the business unit deputy director generals. They are required to put their priorities down on paper so that the compliance teams can then decide what's important. But is it then their agenda versus the agenda of the business unit who set the policy, or who sort of operate the implementation of it? I don't know. I think this is a new game in town that we really have to think very carefully about, because it doesn't all work so well.
And it goes to the relationship management ultimately, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. But I mean, you can have a great relationship in there, and everybody set and direction is set together, and you all own that part in it, but then still have someone going off doing something quite different.
Yeah. So, I mean, from an organisational perspective, I guess in terms of, and this one to you, Peter, because I think Debbie's picked up on this implicitly, a key challenge, or what to you is a key challenge in the dialogue and design area. Debbie's already touched upon one thing. Over the next 18 months with your new job, there's a lot of it about, I'm sure.
Yeah, and look, I think in part it's contextual. So right now there's been so much that's been driven out of COVID that we're all trying to find a new stability. You know, what's our new normal? And there are a range of people that have been engaged in processes through COVID, which will be looking to engage further, but in a different sort of state. So I think it's my own view is that's a real opportunity for us collectively across the system, and we need to make the most of that.
Peter, Debbie, thank you both very much. You've been absolutely terrific, and you too have members of the audience. You're still there. I close as I always do with the closing karakia of MB. Ka hiki te tapu, ke wati ai te ara, kia taruki ai te o marama, hui e, taiki e. Stay safe, stay well. We're back at the end of next month. Thanks again to Debbie and to Peter, members of the audience. Thank you to you all, and ka kite anō.